Hi, Andeline. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight in Australia and today in South Africa to talk about your research and all of the really fascinating work that you're doing over there, especially with young people, which is particularly interesting. But I just wanted to start off by asking you to give us all a bit of a quick summary of where you're at with your current research work.
Okay, hi. Thank you for having me. I'm involved in a few different research projects, but mostly my PhD. And what I'm interested in is group music therapy processes for adolescents referred for aggression, and particularly the relationship between aggression and empathy. Because our common sense understanding is that as one's empathy increases, one's aggressive interactions would decrease. But it's actually not quite as simple as that. And there is some research over time that has given those indications, but there was a big meta-analysis done in 2013, and this illustrated that there's actually much less of a relationship between these two than we thought. And some of the reasons behind that is our construct of empathy is quite narrow, and it's a very complex thing. I mean, as we know, we've got cognitive empathy, where we can put ourselves mentally in someone else's shoes, but then there's also affective empathy, where we emotionally resonate with someone. And if you think of something like situations where parents would shake their babies when babies crying and crying, and parents are just getting so distressed by the baby's distress, and they are feeling that they're having a high level of affective empathy, and they just want this to stop, and so they shake the baby. That's someone with high empathy. And even if you think of teens bickering behind each other's backs, there can also be a high level of cognitive empathy, because if I can put myself in your shoes, I'm more capable to devise some gossip plan to hurt you. So it's not just about high levels of empathy, it's about high levels of empathic responses. So how do we look at this in more complex ways? So that's sort of the topic that I'm looking at. But then I'm also, just to make my life more complicated, interested in how does the way that we research something inform the kind of findings that we can get. So I'm doing 2 case studies. I'm working at the same school. And my one group, I'm looking at from a phenomenological perspective, particularly Husserl's ideas around phenomenology. And so I'm looking at what does that mean for if I sit inside that paradigm earth, what does that mean for how I ask research questions, for how I design the study, for how I read literature and how I write up that literature, for how I conduct sessions, what does it mean to be a phenomenological music therapist? And then how do I collect data? How do I interpret my findings? In my other half, I'm doing a case study on a group, and I'm looking at that from a social constructionist perspective, particularly in relation to the ideas of Gergen, who looked at us as relational beings. So there's not you as a separate self and me as a separate self. We are in this relational space together. Relationship is ontology. And also from Deleuze and Guattari, who speak of all sorts of interesting post-structuralist things like rhizomes. I'm driving my family and friends a bit crazy because I'm seeing rhizomes everywhere. But these tap roots of core truth. This is how things should be. I am the proficient therapist, and you are the deficient client, and I'm here to fix you. Rhizomes are these complex root systems with lots of interconnections, and so it sounds a little bit complicated, but in essence, what I'm saying is I'm looking at these processes from 2 different research perspectives and seeing what comes out of it.
Gosh,
so that's my PhD. And then other research things. So I spoke at a conference yesterday with a colleague of mine called Jonathan Crossley, who's a performer and an educator and an innovator, and he's developed this thing called the cyber guitar, where he's taken his electric guitar and done all sorts of crazy things to it and adapted it in all sorts of ways, and it makes weird sounds and does all sorts of things. And this conference was a jazz pedagogy conference, and we were looking at why is it that within the jazz world there's more of an openness to improvisation on an instrument, although sometimes it's still within a rule-based space, but less openness to actually improvising with the instrument itself. Why don't we adapt pianos and adapt violins and do all sorts of crazy things with our instruments? So we came together, and I spoke as a music therapist who comes at improvisation from a very open, whatever the client brings into the space is welcomed, and we don't put boundaries on what is acceptable or not, because the person's music is a representation of who they are in the world, and we want to receive them as all they are. So how do our two perspectives come together and offer something that we can speak on at a jazz pedagogy conference? So that was interesting. And then I'm busy collecting data in my teaching process, particularly on how to teach reflexivity to arts therapists. So in research classes, I use arts-based methods to process issues around reflexivity. So we do Play-Doh and dancing and movements and singing to think about our research. And then I'm also interested in workshops that I run around culture and race, because that's a particular area of interest in me. So how do we really get developing music therapists to climb into their own racism inside of themselves? Because we all have it. We have aversive racism that lives within us. And as music therapy students, if we can't create a safe space together where we can put that on the table, and even when it hurts inside of ourselves, to go there, to really go there for the benefits of our growing practice. So I'm interested in gathering data on my research classes to write up stuff like that. And then I've supervised a lot of students over time. In the last 2 years, let's say, I've done some of my students' topics have been around more clinical-based stuff, so things around negative symptoms and schizophrenia and forensic adult clients in psychiatric hospitals. I've got a student working with patients who've had strokes. I've got one doing a narrative inquiry with adolescents who self-harm. Another one looking at resilience in youth at risk, self-esteem in children. One ran open groups for homeless adults. One looked at vitality and co-worker trust in a bank. He ran some music therapy sessions there. And then an interesting one was also on collaborations between a music therapist and a physio, to look at what they can offer each other and what works and what doesn't, and how they engage in that collaborative process together. So that's just some of it.
Goodness me. I have the strongest sensation when I'm listening to you of enormous energy, because I know that in your context that you're racing ahead to get your PhD, because there isn't actually anybody in South Africa at the moment who's a music therapist with a PhD, and I can hear the deeply philosophical approach that you're really immersed in right now, where you're investigating not just what is music therapy and is it effective, but really challenging all of the assumptions around how you might decide if it's effective and why and from what perspective. And so really inspirational, I think, for people who are listening to you and who may also be in countries where there isn't a lot of people with PhDs yet, or, but to hear that the depth of the research is really happening, as well as that incredible breadth. So thank you for telling us about all of that. Can you tell us a little bit about the context of music therapy research in South Africa?
I think we're getting there slowly, but because there's a small pool of us, relatively small, there's a lot of people with a lot of balls in the air, and that can be challenging. And the music therapy therapists who've been in the process for a number of years now of setting up a really good NGO in the Cape area, and then there's lots working in clinical practice. But because we're still in that season where we sort of have to prove ourselves, and once you start working at an organization, for example, once they see the work, people are often very blown away and then much more keen to create a post, but then there's still budgetary issues. We often work in under-resourced areas. So I think there are many people who want to do research and who want to write up what they're doing, but just the practicalities of life make that difficult. And I think slowly we're working towards a place where we're supporting each other more. Our association is getting much stronger. So I feel like we're turning a corner. And it's myself and a colleague of mine, Carol Lotte, who's also doing her PhD. She's also near the end. So it's been slow, but I think the tide is turning. I think the energy is growing.
Wow, because when you talk about it being slow and then I look at how fast you're moving, it's hard to put those two ideas together, but it's really important to name that, isn't it? So why do you think that research is important? Why do you think it's going to make the difference for the development of the profession in South Africa, or what's your thoughts?
I think it's important because our medium is such a powerful one, and I think it's one of the ways that we honor it by taking the time to deepen our understanding of it. And like you mentioned about my emphasis on sort of theoretically climbing into it, I think it also comes from a faith and a real trust in what we do and the power that music therapy has. I think if we just dive in and hope for the best, music therapy is something with such substance that if we do it properly, I mean, whatever that is, that's such a big idea, but if we do it responsibly and carefully and with integrity, we see such profound change happening in the lives of people that we work together with. And so we can have the faith that there's the depth inside of what we do to really climb in and understand why. We don't just have to sit at the surface level and hope for the best, because there's so much rooted in it. I also think we became music therapists, most of us, because we really care about being part of journeying with others as they explore ways to make their life better. And for me, that care for our client also translates into a desire to contribute to music therapy research and understanding how we can do it as best as possible. It comes down, I mean, as much as I love theory and literature, and it's not at the end of the day, it's about people. And we have the privilege of doing that, and we want to do that properly.
Gosh.
Also, I know this idea that the people who write about music therapy have power in how they construct the form that our profession takes, and I'm not entirely comfortable with that, because it can get a bit political and unhealthy. I find the space, for example, between community music and community music therapy an interesting one, because I teach in both spaces. And when students ask me, well, what's the difference? I say, well, we get to decide what the difference is going to be. And as much as there's a scope of practice that's regulated by our different health professions council, and we respect that, within that, we've got so much creativity and freedom to form what this is going to be. It's such a wonderfully creative task. And we get to do that together. So even if there is someone who's writing and who has a voice per se, I want it to be a voice that is a collaborative voice where let's talk together and share together. But practically, I think we've got to grow the profession more in my context, in all of our contexts, to share the workload, and also not to drop people in the deep end. My training was wonderful and I'm really grateful for it. But I think also there's a difference between writing up your thesis and writing up a research article. And sometimes we take it for granted that people can make that transition easily, or what it means to do a big old thesis, but also what it means to write up a case study from your practice. So I think we need to put more things in place to support people and guide them and mentor them, so that sometimes it's a few easy things, a few things that people have given me along the way that have been so helpful, that I'm now invested in giving to, sharing with students, so that process is a bit easier for them.
Gosh, I can hear how collaborative you are too, because in some countries an expert model is a really dominant form, whereas I can hear, and it seems of course very suitable in your cultural context, that collaboration and partnership must be key. Now, I'm conscious that we've just about run out of time, so I really just wanted to say thank you for beginning the conversation about research, and for giving everybody who's listening the chance to hear about what's happening, and just to, be inspired to go and look up your work, and as you write more and more and find time somehow to do that too, that people will look up your name and read your material, and certainly feel free to give you an email if they can't get their hands on something.
I'd love to.
Well, it's wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.